Okay, so picking up where we left off last time, we're going to talk a little bit about pagan virtues and Christian virtues in Beowulf. There's kind of a mixture of both. Um, for one thing, Beowulf as a leader is willing to sacrifice himself. So this is like Christ. He's willing to sacrifice himself on the cross. So this is a Christian virtue. He uses his body, not strategy or weapons, to overcome. So he's not he doesn't use a sword to overcome Grendel. He uses his own body, like Christ on the cross. Beowulf trusts God and submits to his providence or fate, like Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he says, um, "Not my will, but your will be done." And it was Providence that Beowulf had decided not to use a sword on Grendel because, as we found out, it wouldn't have worked. The swords were ineffective against Grendel. And so it was God's providence that he was able to know to use his hands rather than try and use a sword. There was actually no other way to defeat Grendel, but Beowulf actually couldn't have known that himself. In Beowulf, there's a basic theme of him fighting monsters. During the course of the book, he fights three different monsters. Grendel's the first one, and then there's Grendel's mother, and then the dragon. What do the monsters represent? They represent evil versus good in this case. So the monsters are evil, Beowulf is good. They also represent the strange, the unusual, the nonconformist, the abnormal versus normal. So you might think about monsters in our own day. Can you think of things of people or things that are strange, unusual, nonconformist, abnormal? And actually, I think you can probably think of lots of that, right? So what happens when monsters invade civilized society? And that's what Grendel kind of shows us, right? The destruction that happens to civilization when they are let loose on society. So maps of the medieval world often featured monsters in them, especially sea monsters, on the edges of the map. So if you go out to the edges of medieval maps, you would tend to find these dragons or sea monsters that would inhabit the unknown regions of the map on the outer edges. And so Grendel is a little like this. He's a monster that inhabits the outer edge of civilization. He's outside of civilization, but he's close enough that he can wreak havoc on it. So looking at Christianity in Beowulf, the story is from a time when the Anglo-Saxons were recent converts to Christianity. They look back on their own ancestors with love, but they realize that they were pagans, and they see that they weren't really Christians. How can they reconcile those two things? They love their ancestors, but they realize that they're not Christians, and therefore, where are their ancestors? What happened to them? Are they in hell? So Beowulf is a Christianization of their great ancestors, seeing in them kind of a primeval Christianity, a tendency towards Christianity, even though they maybe weren't really Christian. This is similar to how many Christians might see like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle as proto-Christians. Reconciling our own history with Christ is an important part of life. Reconciling Western philosophy, legends, and myths and history with Christianity is a major project of medieval literature. Boethius in The Consolation of Philosophy, which we're going to read next, and Dante in his Divine Comedy also do a lot of work on trying to reconcile legends and pagan mythology to Christianity to a certain extent. So in Beowulf, the poem's meter uses four strong beats per line. And then there's also the use of a caesura, which is that the line falls into two parts with a pregnant pause between them. The Anglo-Saxon poetry didn't use rhyme so much, but used alliteration, words that would sound with the same that would start with the same sound within the line. And it also would use kennings, which is kind of poetic ways of saying something simple. For instance, the sun would be called the world's candle, or the sea would be called the swan road or the whale's road. So Beowulf is a good versus evil story. Grendel and his mother represent everything that is evil, or even maybe the devil himself. And there is no way to sympathize with them. They are clearly anti-God, anti-civilization, and murderous. Beowulf represents everything that is good. He's a great warrior and also a great gentleman. In other words, he embodies chivalry. And later a great king. In a way, he represents Christ, but also Christians in general. Later in the book, the dragon will also directly represent the devil. So in the life of the Christian, we can see both a tendency towards being like Grendel, being kind of antisocial and losing control of ourselves, and also towards being like Beowulf, being strong, relying on God's help, aspiring to nobility. Christians constantly battle against evil by resisting temptation, rebuking those who do wrong, going to confession, praying for help or grace to overcome evil in our own lives. In the poem, Beowulf is often said to have relied on God's help in order to defeat the various monsters. That comes up when he's talks about defeating Grendel and about Grendel's mother and the dragon. And this may have been a response in a certain part of the author to the Pelagian heresy, which was common at the time. The Pelagian heresy was the idea that we can get to heaven just on our own good works without God's help, which is God's grace that he gives us to help us to be able to do the right thing. And the Catholic perspective is that we do need God's help. We can't do it completely on our own. We need to pray and ask God to help us, and he will help us to become holy. We can't do that on our own. Another thing that's interesting to note is that there's some similarities between Grendel and Beowulf. So Grendel, the monster, has the strength of 30 men. He actually goes into Hrothgar's hall, kills 30 men on the first day that he attacks Hrothgar's hall. It also says in the poem that Beowulf has the strength of 30. Both of them are great warriors. And as we're going to find out in the section about Grendel's mother, both of them seem to be able to live underwater for an extended period of time, or at least breathe underwater without any problem. Grendel and his mother live in a mere, or a lake, deep down underneath in a cave. And Beowulf is able to go down there for over a day and fight them. Now the differences between Grendel and Beowulf, the first one is chivalry. Chivalry means you're a great warrior, but you're also a great gentleman. And that would be that's what Beowulf has, but Grendel lacks self-control, and he's not able to control himself. He's a great warrior, but he's out of control. Also, Beowulf is community-oriented. He's interested in preserving civilization and preserving the Danes and helping them to keep their community together and keep it from being destroyed by Grendel. whereas Grendel is self-oriented. He's only interested in himself and basically getting vengeance for himself. He doesn't care about the community. Finally, Grendel hates God, and we know that he attacked the hall of Herat because Beowulf and the Danes are singing the songs of creation inside of it. So that's another difference, is that the Danes and Beowulf love God. Grendel hates God. So after the defeat of Grendel, there's a big celebration in Herat, which we talked about briefly. And there's a bard there, somebody who tells stories and sings songs. He sings the song of Finn, or that tells the poem of Finn, in lines 1070 to 1170. And this is a story which shows the importance of vengeance as part of the moral values of the Danes. This is a good example of how there are some pagan virtues which are extolled in Beowulf. Vengeance is definitely not a Christian virtue. The Danes under King Heaney had been guests at the court of King Finn of Frisia, who is Heaney's brother-in-law. There was a marriage between Finn is the king of the Frisians, and Heaney, the king of the Dane. Finn and Heaney's sister. So she's the sister of the king of the Danes. And this was supposed to kind of bring the two peoples together, the Frisians and the Danes, who had been fighting for a long time, and hopefully make them friends again between these two tribes. But during the feast that they hold, presumably the marriage feast, old grievances come up again. A battle begins, and King Heaney, the king of the Danes, is killed. His second in command holds out with the Danish troops, and finally Finn, the king of the Frisians, offers peace to them. They will be given separate quarters from the Frisians, and they will be given gifts of rings, the same as Finn's troops. But after they spend a winter of peace in the Frisian court, Hengist, the leader of the Danes, and the Danish troops rise up against Finn to get their revenge, and Finn and most of his men are killed. So this is the side story that's told about Finn and his men. The basic moral of the story seems to be that even if you achieve some sort of peace with your enemy, there's still going to be that desire for vengeance, and they might still strike back and kill you anyway. During the feast, so the Song of Finn is over, and Queen Wealhtheow, who is Hrothgar's wife, is a little bit worried about her two sons if Beowulf gets adopted by Hrothgar. Hrothgar has said that he wants to adopt Beowulf as a son. She's wondering if that means that Beowulf is going to be his heir in the sense of being the next king of the Danes. But at the same time, she also rewards Beowulf for his courage in defeating Grendel with a torque, or a large ring that goes around his neck of gold. So Hrothgar and Beowulf then leave the hall for their beds. They're not sleeping in the hall that night. And Grendel's mother, seeking vengeance, ends up entering the hall that night. And she kills one of Hrothgar's top advisors and carries him away, escaping back to her underwater lair in the mere, or the lake. I will read a bit about that. They went to sleep, and one paid dearly for his night's ease, as had happened to them often ever since Grendel occupied the gold hall, committing evil until the end came. An avenger lurked and was still alive. Grendel's mother, monstrous hell-bride, brooded on her wrongs. She had been forced down into the fearful waters and cold depths after Cain had killed his father's son, felled his own brother with a sword. Branded an outlaw, marked by having murdered, he moved into the wilds, shunned company and joy, and from Cain there sprang misbegotten spirits, among them Grendel. But now his mother had sailed forth on a savage journey, grief-racked and ravenous, desperate for revenge. So she comes into the hall. The Helldam, it says, was in a panic, desperate to get out, a mortal terror the moment she was found. She had pounced and taken one of the retainers in a tight hold. This is Aesir. She grabs and she kills him. To Hrothgar, this man was the most beloved of friends. Beowulf was elsewhere, because the Geat had been given another lodging. There was an uproar in Heorot. She had snatched their trophy, Grendel's bloody hand. So she takes Aesir, one of Hrothgar's top advisors, and she also takes Grendel's arm, which Beowulf had hung on the wall after he had ripped it off. The next day, Hrothgar summons Beowulf to tell him about the death of Aesir and the attack of Grendel's mother. He says, "She has taken up the feud because of last night when you killed Grendel. This is a force for evil, driven to avenge her kinsman's death." So again, Grendel's mother is taking vengeance in the same way the Danes had taken vengeance against Finn in the previous story. Hrothgar goes on to say that he had heard it said by my people in the hall that they have seen two such creatures. So Hrothgar kind of knew that there was a mother out there also, prowling the moors, huge marauders from some other world. One of these things looks like a woman, the other, warped in the shape of a man, moves beyond the pale, bigger than any man, an unnatural birth called Grendel by the country people. Their ancestry is hidden in a past of demons and ghosts, and they dwell apart among the wolves on the hills, on the wind-swept crags and treacherous keshes. Then he describes the place where they live. A few miles from here, a frost-stiffened wood waits and keeps watch above a mere, that's a lake. The overhanging bank is a maze of tree roots mirrored in its surface. At night there something uncanny happens. The water burns, and the mere bottom has never been sounded by the sons of men. On its bank, the hart, or the deer, in flight from pursuing hounds, will turn to face them with firm-set horns and die in the wood rather than dive beneath its surface. That is no good place. So it's such a scary place that a deer that's going to be killed by pursuing hounds would rather die by that than jump into this spooky lake. So Beowulf agrees to go and try to defeat Grendel's mother also. They go to the mere, or the lake, which is inhabited by dragons and other evil creatures, and they find Aesir's head on the way. Aesir is the trusted servant of Hrothgar who had been killed by Grendel's mother. At this point, Unferth, who had earlier insulted Beowulf, gives his sword Hunting to Beowulf as a gift, and Beowulf jumps into the lake and swims to the bottom. And there he finds the lair, or the cave that Grendel's mother lives in. Providence is also shown here because the rest of Beowulf's followers can't help him at this point. They can only watch. The bottom is a day's swim away. And this is the second time we're shown that he's a great swimmer. Interestingly, the underwater den which he lives in is lighted by a fire, which shows you the unworldliness of this. Grendel's mother at this point sees him and grabs him and tries to take him to her cave. He tries to attack her with his sword, but to no effect. Like Grendel, she's totally immune to swords. And then she tries to stab him with a knife, but the knife is stopped from going through his chest by his armor that he's wearing. So this is the second time in a row here where swords have no good effect. At this point in the story, he, by providence, finds a sword that is in the lair of Grendel's mother. It's a gigantic sword, so big that only Beowulf would be able to handle it. And with this sword, he kills her. And when he kills her, the sword melts in her blood. It's almost as if the sword had been made or provided just for that purpose, to kill Grendel's mother. It's ironic that she had kept the only sword that could kill her in her own lair. Here's what the poem says about finding the sword. Holy God decided the victory. It was easy for the Lord, the ruler of heaven, to redress the balance once Beowulf got back upon his feet. Then he saw a blade that boded well, a sword in her armory, an ancient heirloom from the days of the giants, an ideal weapon, one that any warrior would envy. But so huge and heavy of itself that only Beowulf could wield it in battle. So the shielding's hero, that's Beowulf, hard-pressed and enraged, took a firm hold of the hilt and swung the blade in an arc. A resolute blow that bit deep into her neckbone and severed it entirely, toppling the doomed house of her flesh. She fell to the floor. So, at the point where Grendel's mother dies, the Geats and the Danes that are waiting up at the top of the mere, or the lake, see her blood come to the surface, and they assume that Beowulf has died. The Danes are sad, and they return home, assuming he's dead. But the Geats, his countrymen, stay on at the shore of the lake, hoping that possibly Beowulf is still alive. Providence and typology are apparent in the sword that Beowulf finds, as it is engraved on the hilt with the story of the flood, which cleansed the world of giants. And this is exactly what Beowulf is doing. He's cleansing the world of giants. Let's just talk about the symbolic meaning of the flood real fast. The mirror also represents a flood. The flood is God's wrath against sin. It is cleansing and purification, like baptism from sin. It represents salvation. The flood buried the old world, and it also brings a new beginning to the world with the people that remain, the very few people that remain. And that represents us bearing our sins and starting our new life in Christ. The flood represents expiation by water. Expiation is erasing, making up for sin, after which the new world is created. And it represents judgment of sin and of grace. Judgment, like the final judgment, it's a judgment of sinners that leads to their death and destruction. But grace in the sense of being saved by the ark. The ark is in a lot of ways is like the church, right? The church is a way that we are saved, the way that we are saved from our sins, from the work that Christ does through the church. The flood is similar to the end of the world, which the end of the world is followed by judgment and heaven or hell. So we talked about the blood rising to the surface from Grendel's mother. and those watching the blood assume that Beowulf is dead. This is kind of symbolic also. It's a reminder of that Christ, he shed his blood and he died for our sins, and they assume that's what Beowulf did. They assume that Beowulf was killed by Grendel's mother and that he died in an attempt to save them. He actually didn't, and then when he reemerges at the top of the water again, in their minds, it's like he's come back from the dead, right? Because they assumed that he was dead. So it's like a rebirth in baptism, or maybe like a resurrection. And so in a way, Beowulf in this scene is a little bit representative of Christ. He obviously is not Christ, and but he is symbolic of him in that way. Before he comes to the surface, he finds Grendel's body in the lair and cuts off its head, and then he returns to the surface with Grendel's head. The Geats carry the head home in triumph, and another victory feast is held at Herat. At this point, during the victory feast, the story of Heremod is told. This is around line 1710. So it says in the book about Heremod that his rise in the world brought little joy to the Danish people, but only death and destruction. He was one of their previous kings. He vented his rage on men he caroused with. He killed his own comrades, a pariah king, who cut himself off from his own kind, even though Almighty God had made him eminent and powerful and marked him from the start for a happy life. So Heremod is an example of how not to be a king. Killing your own people is not a way to be a good king. And this is what Hrothgar is trying to point out here. He says, so learn from this and understand true values. Hrothgar also warns him about the dangers of having the power of being a king, and not to let it go to your head. So at this point in the story, around line 1800, Beowulf has finished his job in Daneland. He's defeated the two monsters that are plaguing them. They've rewarded him with many treasures, and he proceeds to return home to his home country of Geatland, in what's today Sweden, and then to tell King Hygelac of Geatland about his adventures. So the story about Grendel and his mother are repeated here with some additional details. Besides telling the stories again about Grendel and his mother, there are some side stories that are told. One is the story of Friawaru's wedding. And the lesson of this is around line 2030, is that women are not always able to be peace weavers between ancient enemies. So the ideal role of women in Beowulf is seen to be peace weavers, to make peace between enemies, to be hospitable to guests. Obviously, Grendel's mother is the opposite of that. We had talked about the story of Finn, where there was a wedding between two royal families, and thinking that would make peace, but then it ended up turning into a war. And now there's another peace wedding being made with Friawaru, and again, the situation happens where old hostilities are rekindled at the wedding banquet. And instead of peace, it results in war. The story of Queen Hyde is also told about this point in lines 1930 to 1960. And this is to emphasize the importance of a king being generous. Generosity was seen as a key virtue of a king by the Anglo-Saxons. So we learned that Beowulf had been previously underestimated by the Geats in line 2180. It says he had been poorly regarded for a long time. He was taken by the Geats for less than he was worth, and their lord, too, had never much esteemed him in the mead hall. They firmly believed that he lacked force, that the prince was a weakling. But presently every affront to his deserving was reversed. So he finally got the credit that was due to him. We then find out that when Beowulf returns to Hygelac, the king of the Geats, he actually gives all the treasures that he was given by Hrothgar. He gives them all to Hygelac as a gift and a sign of loyalty. In spite of his great accomplishments, he ends up with no reward. Hygelac gets them all. He does them all for his own king. So this is part of his virtue. He shows loyalty in spite of his great success, right? He could have said, well, now I'm a greater warrior than Hygelac, I should be king. But instead, he gives everything that he gained to Hygelac and gives his complete loyalty to him as well. So Hygelac might have felt about Beowulf the same way that Saul, King Saul in the Bible, felt about King David, that is, very jealous because Beowulf was so successful. Just like David killed Goliath, Beowulf kills Grendel and his mother, and Hygelac could have been very jealous of that and maybe felt that Beowulf was a threat to his power. But that feeling is subdued by Beowulf's gift of all that he gained to Hygelac, and Hygelac in return gives gifts to Beowulf. He gives him swords and a lot of land. So going back briefly to Grendel's mother and the battle against Grendel's mother, this battle is symbolic of our own battle against original sin. The monsters represent Cain, or original sin. They also represent chaos and the devil. Our spiritual struggle against sin in our own life is also a battle. Grendel and his mother are a symbol of Adam and Eve, the originators of original sin. Our battle to defeat sin in our own life with God's help or grace is an important goal in life. So we had talked briefly also about how women ideally are seen in Beowulf as being peacemakers and hospitable. In that way, Grendel's mother is the anti-type of a woman. She's the complete opposite of what a woman should be. Instead of a peace weaver, she takes vengeance, not something a woman are supposed to do. Women represent hospitality. Grendel's mother is the exact opposite of this. She tries to kill people that come to her lair. Women are described in the poem as peace weavers and hospitable. Another interesting thought is that Grendel, sometimes people have wondered about the other side of the story. You know, when there's something that happens, a story that happens like this, it's not usually one-sided, right? And the way this story is told is very one-sided. It seems like Grendel and his mother are just pure evil and Beowulf is pure good. In reality, that's seldom the case, right? Usually there is another side to the story that kind of makes sense, and you can kind of see why both sides were to a certain extent justified. So is it possible that Grendel maybe had good reasons to hate the Danes outside of what is in the poem? You know, what was his side of the story? There are several movies about Beowulf, and one of them has a side story about Grendel that posits that basically that earlier, a generation earlier, when Grendel was a child, Hrothgar and his men had been confronted by Grendel's father while Grendel was with him. And in the ensuing battle, they had killed Grendel's father and almost killed Grendel while he was a child. But they killed Grendel's father right in front of him while he was a child. Now, this is in the movie. This is not in the poem. But it is interesting, and that would provide a motivation for why Grendel would want to get revenge so badly against the Danes, and why he would haunt their hall for 12 years and kill them. The final moral of the story of Beowulf and these monsters is that death is inescapable. No matter how heroic a person is, everyone dies. The story begins and ends with a funeral, the funeral of Shield Chieftain, and at the end of this book, the funeral of Beowulf. Every Ash Wednesday, we hear the words, "Remember, man, that thou art dust, and to dust you shall return." So that in itself is a very Christian theme. And as I had mentioned earlier, the poem itself is somewhat anachronistic. It's written by a very devout Christian, probably around 750 to 800 AD. But it takes place several centuries earlier in a time and place that historically is pagan, at least in the land of the Danes. But the characters seem to be more or less Christian in a lot of ways. A lot of the things they say indicate that they believe in the one true God. Except for, of course, that one time when, after Grendel attacks, they go back and return to paganism and offer pagan sacrifices, which the author roundly condemns.